For this discussion for China and the world, you will be learning quite a bit about Dengism, which I think is very important and would argue is very important because there's a tendency for Americans to misunderstand this period of market reforms in Chinese history and refer to it as an acceptance of capitalism, which of course it is not. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party is still the ruling party in China, and instead what you see under Dengism is an emergence of communism or socialism with Chinese characteristics. And you will have to think a bit about this phrase for your discussion post, and we will put this information on Deng and the rise of Dengism, Deng Xiaoping that is, and the rise of Dengism in conversation with the work of one of his proteges in the 1980s from your reading. Deng Xiaoping gradually becomes the de facto leader of the People's Republic of China after the death of Mao Zedong in 1976. He is responsible for creating the architecture of the contemporary People's Republic of China in terms of its governance structures. He did draw some influence from Soviet economic state reforms, such as the Kostian Reform of 1965, which was sometimes called the Lieberman Reform or the 1965 economic reforms. These were a series of planned changes in the centralized Soviet economy. The centerpiece of these changes was the introduction of sales and profit as indicators of a state enterprise success. Now, Americans looked at this and said that this was capitalism, but of course it wasn't capitalism. It's quite different than capitalism because you're still talking about state enterprise and a centralized economy. Another potential influence for some of Deng's economic reforms were the 1979 Soviet economic reforms, which were focused on improving and planning and reinforcing the effects of economic mechanisms in the Soviet Union and raising the effectiveness of production while improving the quality of work, focused predominantly on essentially efficiency, economic efficiency, and centralization. The policy or practice of restructuring or reforming the Soviet economy and political system was watched, critiqued, and responded to by thinkers within the People's Republic of China. Then you also have finally the perestroika reforms of the 1980s, the policy or practice of restructuring, reforming economic and political systems, which was put forward by Leonid Brezhnev in 1979 and actively promoted by Mikhail Gorbachev. Perestroika originally referred to increased automation and labor efficiency. So not really much to do with economic reforms besides the centralization of the economy and increased automation. But later, perestroika came to entail greater awareness of economic markets and the decentralization of economic markets, eventually resulting in the ending of a centralized planned economy, which still remained a socialist economy but was no longer a centralized planned socialist economy. So, with this in mind, some anti-communists, and especially American anti-communists, began to argue that the reforms initiated under Deng Xiaoping would be accepting capitalism. And we could simply ask the hypothetical, is that true? And I've drawn upon a popular picture of Deng Xiaoping here from an international appearance, but his lips just happen to look like they're saying the words no. Deng Xiaoping's key programs in government all fell under the umbrella of a philosophy, a political philosophy, which he termed socialism with Chinese characteristics. This was the theoretical system of socialism with Chinese characteristics, being a broad term for political theories and policies that are seen by their proponents as representing Marxist-Leninism adapted to Chinese circumstances and specific time periods. In August of 1980, Deng Xiaoping started China's political reforms by setting term limits for officials in proposing a systemic revision of China's third constitution, which was made under Hua Gufeng. The National College Entrance Examination, the NCEE, commonly known as the Gaokao, or the higher education exam, kind of similar to the SATs, was an academic examination that was reinitiated as well. In fact, there was overall centralized economic reforms. A 9-year compulsory education was reintroduced or introduced for the first time in some areas. So this is essentially a compulsory primary education. The National College entrance exams were resumed, and there was also the development of a H382 program. The NCEE was a standardized test that was a prerequisite for entrance into higher education institutions at the undergraduate level. The H382 program, by contrast, focused on research university development and state high-tech development. It was a program that was funded and administered by the central government of the People's Republic of China. It was highly centralized research and highly centralized support of academic research, and especially focusing on the fields of science and technology and the development of science and technology, and it was incredibly effective. In addition to the introduction of term limits, there were also some other impacts of Deng Xiaoping's rule. Internationally, there was the Third Indochina War, prompted by the Socialist Republic of Vietnam's invasion of Democratic Kampuchea, or the DK regime, Pol Pot's regime in Cambodia in 1979. The Communist Party of Vietnam and the People's Army of Vietnam then invaded Cambodia, deposed Pol Pot's regime, which was also nominally communist, but really more ethno-nationalist in Cambodia. And as a direct result, the People's Republic of China invaded Vietnam in 1979, leading to a very quick border conflict. The poster on the left-hand side of the slide, Tan Nhut Din Tang, refers to the Vietnamese victories over the French, of course, in 1954, Dien Bien Phu, and then the Republic of Vietnam and the Americans in 1973, but in 1975, the final victory over the Republic of Vietnam, even though U.S. troops had already withdrawn in 1973, and the victory over the People's Republic of China in 1979. If you have greater interest in this, I would encourage you to take the Vietnam Wars class with me. This will be coming up not next semester in the spring, but perhaps in another couple of semesters. Another feature of international policy and national policy politically was the Hong Kong policy and the Tiananmen Square incident. The Tiananmen Square incident will be the focus of our second discussion this week, so we'll spend a little bit of time focusing on the Hong Kong policy now. The Hong Kong policy developed under Deng Xiaoping was actually a policy for both Hong Kong and Macau. One country, two systems was a constitutional principle of the People's Republic of China describing the governance of Hong Kong and Macau since they became special administrative regions, or SARs, of the People's Republic of China in 1997 and 1999, respectively. However, one country, two systems was formulated in the 1980s by Deng Xiaoping during the negotiations with the United Kingdom over Hong Kong. Deng Xiaoping suggested that there would be only one China, but that these regions could retain their own economic and administrative systems, while the rest of mainland China uses the socialism with Chinese characteristic principles. Then theoretically Hong Kong would be able to develop its own independent system, whatever that may be. They would still be one country, but they could have two systems. Under the principle of one country, two systems, each of the two regions could continue to have its own governmental system, legal, economic, and financial affairs, including trade relations with foreign countries, all of which are independent from those of the mainland of the People's Republic of China. The PRC has also proposed to apply the principle of one country, two systems for its aims with the unification of Taiwan, which has been a long-standing conflict. Now, as part of the context here, it's important to remember that Hong Kong was a colony of the United Kingdom, ruled by a governor appointed by the monarchy of the United Kingdom. It was never a democracy, and it was a colony for 156 years, from 1840, except for 4 years of Japanese imperial rule, authoritarian rule during World War II. So this colony system lasted until 1997. In fact, Hong Kong had never really seen any form of democratic government before that. When, at that point, it was returned to Chinese sovereignty, thus actually increasing the democratic representation of folks who were ethnically Chinese but viewed themselves as citizens of Hong Kong, because they were no longer subjects of the British Crown. Mainland China agreed to accept some conditions, as it is stipulated in the Sino-British Joint Declaration, such as the drafting or adoption of Hong Kong's mini-constitution basic law before its return. The Hong Kong Basic Law ensured that Hong Kong would retain its capitalist-like economic system, its own currency, the Hong Kong dollar, a separate legal system, a legislative system that was nominally separate, and the same human rights and freedoms guaranteed by the Chinese government, and for a period of 50 years. This would be then set to expire in 2047, and the current arrangement has permitted Hong Kong to function as its own entity under the name of Hong Kong, China, in many international settings, such as the incredibly important but symbolic setting of the Olympics, and the less symbolic but also important setting of the World Trade Organization. The photos that you see here are actually the protests from 2014 in Hong Kong, which took place just before the last time that I was in Hong Kong in 2014 and 2015. There were a series of sit-in protests, often called the Umbrella Revolution and sometimes used interchangeably with the Umbrella Movement. This was actually inspired by the Occupy movement, in part in the United States, and the Arab Spring, both of which took place in 2011. Many of the tactics were in fact quite similar. This occurred in Hong Kong from September 26 to December 15th of 2014, and it was predominantly a youth protest movement that was in support of pro-democracy reforms. Nonetheless, the context for this movement very much was set in place and in contrast with the existing political system in Hong Kong. It was actually a protest against the government of Hong Kong, much more than it was a protest against the government of the People's Republic of China, a circumstance that is commonly brushed over. Nonetheless, reflecting on this circumstance, what would you say the major trajectories and important points about Dengism are for us to remember? Why is it so critical to understand Deng Xiaoping's innovations and his development of socialism with Chinese characteristics? Go ahead and make a quick post and let's move on.